On the cold morning of 14th of February 1797, off the towering cliffs of Cape St. Vincent, the Atlantic Ocean lay swathed in a grey, shifting haze. For hours, a dense February fog had rolled across the swells, muting the colour of the sea into a dull iron sheet. Out of that haze drifted a sound, low, muffled, and unmistakable. It was the distant thud of heavy guns, echoing across the water like the heartbeat of an unseen giant. Every officer and sailor in the British fleet knew what it meant. Somewhere in the murk, a fleet far larger than their own was stirring. This was the moment the Royal Navy had been waiting for. Under the command of Admiral Sir John Jervis, a seasoned commander whose iron discipline was matched only by his willingness to force a decisive action, the British had set out to intercept the massive Spanish fleet moving between Cartagena and Cadiz. The stakes were enormous. Spain, newly bound to revolutionary France through the Treaty of San Ildefonso, had become an active belligerent against Britain. If the Spanish fleet joined with the French fleet at Brest, the combined naval force would threaten British control of the seas. Only a bold interception could prevent disaster. That task fell to just 15 British ships of the line, supported by a handful of frigates and smaller vessels. Against them, the Spanish sailed with 25 to 27 ships of the line, including several three-deckers and the colossal four-decked Santísima Trinidad, mounting around 130 guns and carrying over 1,000 men. The Spanish fleet, under Lieutenant General Don José de Córdoba y Ramos, was enormous in size and manpower, likely more than 20,000 men at sea compared to roughly half that in the British fleet. Yet on this foggy morning, numbers alone would not determine the shape of the coming battle. What would matter was organization, discipline, and the ability to seize fleeting opportunities before the wind and fog reshaped the combat. And in this realm, Jervis possessed a critical advantage. For days he had been preparing. After withdrawing from the Mediterranean before Franco-Spanish pressure, he consolidated his forces at the Tagus. On 6th of February, he was reinforced by Rear Admiral William Parker's squadron, bringing him up to the 15 ships that now sailed at his command. His fleet, compact, well-drilled, and accustomed to his strict night orders, sailed in tight formation, even through poor visibility. In contrast, the Spanish fleet had been battered by storms and scattered by a fierce Levanta wind. Though Córdoba attempted to regroup, his forces remained strung out across miles of sea, some ships to windward, others to leeward, many only loosely organized into divisions. It was a fleet strong in numbers, but weak in cohesion. As dawn broke through thinning fog, the British officers atop their quarterdecks began to catch sight of shapes emerging from the haze. Massive silhouettes of enemy warships. For an instant, the mist parted enough for Captain Calder, Jervis's flag captain aboard HMS Victory, 100 guns, to make a count. He reported 27 ships of the line visible in dispersed clusters. Though the numerical disparity was daunting, Jervis was unmoved. He maintained his steady course, keeping his line compact and his formations fixed. His fleet was arranged to strike like a spear point. Leading ships such as Culloden, Blenheim, and Prince George stood ready to pierce deep into the enemy's disordered ranks, while the heavier three-deckers, including Victory, Britannia, Barfleur, and Prince George, formed the spine of the British advance. The British sailors waited at their stations, surrounded by the sensory weight of imminent battle. The crisp smell of salt and the cold bite of the winter sea, mixed with the earthy scent of sand freshly spread across the decks to absorb blood and moisture. Gun crews adjusted tackles and priming tools, checking the great 32-pounder cannons that lined the lower decks, ready to unleash the thunder that would shake the morning apart. Overhead, the wind pressed against canvas as the British line advanced, disciplined, unwavering, and resolute. Through the fog, Spanish signals crackled across the air, drums beating, trumpets calling, and the deep boom of distant cannon salutes. Spain's fleet was attempting to form lines, but the weather and confusion rendered it a scattered archipelago of massive hulls. It was into this fractured enemy formation that Jervis intended to drive his numerically inferior but highly cohesive force. Far astern in the line sailed Commodore Horatio Nelson, aboard the 74-gun HMS Captain. Though outranked and far from the vanguard of the British line, Nelson observed these early signs of Spanish disarray with growing intensity. While the fog swirled around his ship, he sensed that the day would present a rare opportunity, one that might be seized only through bold and unconventional action. But for now, he held his position, awaiting the moment when the line would fully engage and the battle's true shape would emerge. As the fog continued to lift, the scale of the Spanish threat came into clearer view. Vast hulls looming through the vapor, sails spread in disorganized patches across the horizon. Jervis, with the cliffs of Cape St. Vincent faintly visible to port, ordered his line to press forward. The British fleet, still tightly held in formation, was preparing to commit itself fully into the heart of the Spanish disarray. The stage was set. The fog was thinning. The guns were primed. The fate of the day, and of British naval supremacy in the age of the French Revolution, hung on the ability of a smaller, disciplined fleet to impose order on chaos. As the February haze thinned across the waters southwest of Portugal, the British line advanced with unwavering precision. The men aboard Admiral Sir John Jervis's fleet could now make out the enemy with greater clarity. Not the neat, well-ordered battle line expected from a major European navy, but a scattered, drifting mass of powerful Spanish ships of the line, some extending toward the windward side, others lagging leeward, each attempting belatedly to form into cohesive divisions. The chaotic state of the Spanish formation was the product of days of storms and the punishing Levanta wind that had blown the fleet out into the Atlantic, complicating its approach to Cadiz. Despite this confusion, the Spanish force was enormous. The colossal Santísima Trinidad, towering above every ship around her, served as the most visible marker of the Spanish presence. With approximately 130 guns arranged across 4 full decks, she was one of the mightiest warships ever built, an imposing symbol of the vast manpower and material strength arrayed against the British. Nearby, other massive first rates such as San Josef and Salvador del Mundo, each mounting more than 112 guns, attempted to regain station. The combined Spanish fleet represented a numerical superiority of nearly 2-to-1 in ships of the line, and perhaps greater than 20,000 men, an immense concentration of naval power adrift in the morning mist. Yet numbers alone could not offset the decisive advantage Jervis now pressed. His own fleet of 15 ships of the line was perfectly formed into a compact and exact line ahead, drilled relentlessly by his night orders. Years of discipline had rendered these ships responsive, coordinated, and intensely confident in their commander's ability to extract victory from difficult odds. In an age where naval battles frequently devolved into chaotic duels between mismatched ships, the ability to maintain formation was as crucial as firepower itself. From the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, Jervis surveyed the distant shapes with a practiced, calculating eye. The Spanish groups were clearly divided, a weather division to the northwest, struggling against the wind to form a coherent line, and a leeward division trailing behind, separated by a broad, exploitable gap. This fracture, created by the morning conditions, presented a fleeting opportunity, one that a more cautious commander might have hesitated to exploit against a larger enemy. Jervis did the opposite. He ordered his fleet to steer directly toward the gap. The British line responded immediately. Culloden, leading the van, advanced like the tip of a spear toward the broken Spanish formation, followed closely by Blenheim, Prince George, and the massive 3-decker Barfleur. These ships prepared to rake the Spanish vessels that drifted toward one another in a slow, uncertain attempt to unite. On board each British ship, the crews braced themselves as the swell shifted and the distance between enemy hulls closed. As the morning brightened, gun ports were opened across the British line, the low decks filled instantly with the heavy odour of gunpowder. Lanterns flickered in the gun bays, illuminating the bronze and iron mouths of 32-pounder cannons prepared to unleash their first broadsides at the command of their captains. Powder monkeys, often mere boys, took up their positions near the hatchways, ready to sprint cartridges from the magazine as soon as the order to fire was given. To starboard, British sailors observed the Spanish ships scrambling to form something resembling a defensive line. Their decks were crowded with soldiers drawn from Spain's larger military establishment. Although formidable in numbers, these men lacked the rigorous gunnery training that British sailors possessed. Many of the Spanish ships were crewed by a mix of experienced seamen, inexperienced recruits, and soldiers unfamiliar with naval combat. This imbalance would soon tilt the battle, as the British relied on a long tradition of rapid, accurate gunnery that consistently outmatched even materially larger foes. By contrast, the British formations tightened still further as they neared the enemy. Officers barked brief commands, though most instructions came through signals and shipboard routines rather than raised voices. The discipline aboard Jervis's fleet meant that few words were needed. Every man knew his station, and every captain knew the intent behind the admiral's bold maneuver. As victory and the main body of the fleet advanced, the Spanish Weather Division began to bear down toward its leeward counterpart, attempting to close the gap before the British line could slip through. But the opportunity had already been seized. The British line passed between the two groups, enabling the rear of Jervis's fleet to engage the Spanish Weather Division while the van engaged the disordered leeward ships. The pressure began to mount on the Spanish captains as they realized the British had forced them into a fragmented fight. Their towering ships, unable to maneuver quickly in the shifting winds, struggled to bring their broadside guns to bear. Meanwhile, the more nimble British 74-gun third rates, such as Orion, Excellent, Colossus, and Goliah, moved into advantageous firing positions, as naturally as schools of fish adjusting to the tide. The tension on the water was palpable. The British line was now perfectly poised, ordered, advancing, and ready to unleash controlled devastation on an enemy that had lost the initiative. The Spanish, grappling with confusion, were about to be struck at 2 points simultaneously. The gap Jervis had exploited would soon widen under British pressure, separating the Spanish fleet further and preventing any chance of a coordinated response. Still lingering astern in the British line, Commodore Horatio Nelson, aboard the 74-gun Captain, observed the shifting tactical situation with increasing intensity. Though far behind the van, he recognized that the Spanish Weather Division, still retaining some maneuvering space, might yet slip away and link with the leeward group to form a massive force that could overwhelm the British line. That possibility loomed ahead like a storm cloud, one that Nelson believed required immediate and independent action. For the moment, though, the eyes of the fleet remained fixed on the tightening gap between the Spanish divisions and the looming explosion of cannon fire that would soon erupt. The air was thick with suspense, the wind tugging at canvas, and the distant cliffs of Portugal watching as two great navies converged. The moment of collision between the two great fleets came just as the fog thinned into pale shafts of winter light. The Spanish ships, still in a loose attempt at reforming, drifted toward one another like massive shadows on the swells. In contrast, the British line pressed forward with a deliberate, almost mechanical precision. The discipline with which Admiral Sir John Jervis's fleet held its formation now revealed its full value. The entire British line of battle advanced as a single, unified spear point aimed directly at the heart of Spanish confusion. At the forefront of that spear sailed HMS Culloden, followed closely by Blenheim, Prince George, and Barfleur. As these leading British ships closed with the leeward Spanish division, the silence broke. The first broadside erupted from Culloden's lower deck, a thunderous volley of 32-pounder shot hurled into the hull of a massive Spanish ship just beginning to bear up and form line. The concussion of that opening salvo rolled down the British line a moment later as each ship prepared to fire in sequence. The sound carried across the water in deep, resonant waves that seemed to shake the fog from the air. In response, the Spanish returned fire, but unevenly. Some of their ships had not yet fully cleared their gun ports. Others fired hurried salvos that plunged into the sea, sending enormous plumes of spray skyward. The cracks of Spanish cannon echoed chaotically, lacking both rhythm and accuracy. British gunners, by contrast, had spent decades refining the art of rapid, controlled fire. They loaded double-shot charges into their guns at closer ranges, one round shot and one canister or bar, each blast inflicting punishing damage on the Spanish decks and rigging. As the British van pressed deeper, tearing into the fragmented Spanish formation, immense clouds of thick grey smoke billowed upward and clung to the sea in drifting curtains. Visibility dropped sharply, replaced by flashes of fire and the roar of cannon. The air grew heavy with the overpowering mix of gunpowder residue, charred wood, and salt spray. Splinters, deadly wooden shards launched by the impact of cannonballs, flew across decks like shrapnel, cutting through rigging, sailcloth, and flesh with equal ferocity. Meanwhile, the great three-deckers of Jervis's line advanced behind the van, their heavy broadsides adding devastating weight to the assault. HMS Victory, the flagship, entered the engagement with the calm inevitability of a tide. Her gun ports opened in perfect order. Inside the lower deck, gunners worked in a hellish glow of lantern light, pushing out the great 32-pounders on their carriages and timing their fire to the rolling of the ship. When the order came, Victory's entire side erupted, the recoil slamming across the deck and nearly driving the gun crews into the opposite bulkheads. The broadside hammered into a Spanish 74, trying desperately to turn into the fight. Behind Victory came Britannia, Barfleur, and Prince George, each adding their fire to the growing inferno. The pressure exerted on the Spanish Leeward Division became overwhelming. Ships that had only moments earlier attempted to consolidate now staggered under the relentless weight of British fire. Hulls cracked open, sails caught fire, topmasts splintered and fell, dragging tangled rigging into the sea. And yet, amidst this chaos, the Spanish Weather Division still held potential danger. These upwind ships possessed enough maneuvering room to alter course, steer down toward their comrades, and attempt to envelop the British line. If successful, this convergence would allow their heavier three-deckers, including those with more than 112 guns, to bear down on Jervis's smaller 74s with crushing power. It was a looming tactical threat, one that could reverse the advantage the British had gained by breaking between the two Spanish groups. The British rear divisions, commanded by Rear Admiral William Parker and Vice Admiral Charles Thompson, engaged these Spanish ships as best they could while maintaining the integrity of the line. Ships like Orion, Blenheim, and Colossus maneuvered to block the Spanish advance, but the enemy still threatened to escape the fragmentation imposed by Jervis's initial move. It was at this moment, amidst drifting smoke, confused signals, and the thunder of broadsides, that Commodore Horatio Nelson, commanding the 74-gun HMS Captain, grasped the full danger. Captain, positioned near the rear of the British line, had only recently come into cannon range. From Nelson's vantage point, the Spanish Weather Division appeared on the edge of slipping away, potentially reforming into a unified body with a numerical strength that would severely challenge the compact British formation. Observing the danger, Nelson understood that adhering strictly to the formal line of battle would allow the Spanish to regroup. The British van had inflicted immense punishment on the Leeward Division, but unless the weather group was held, the battle might yet turn in Spain's favour. In that realization, a critical spark of audacity ignited. Nelson made a decision that defied centuries of naval orthodoxy. By altering course to intercept the Weather Division, he would be leaving the line, abandoning the structured formation that was the backbone of Royal Navy tactics. It was an action that risked both his ship and his reputation, for any officer who broke the line without orders could face severe punishment. But Nelson recognized that the battle itself demanded an immediate, unconventional response. He prepared to steer Captain straight across the path of the British line and into the teeth of the Spanish Weather Division. The ship's crew, sensing the shift in their course, braced themselves. They did not yet know the scale of the audacious maneuver Nelson intended, but they could see the enemy's looming hulls and the rising tension on the decks around them. The fog of war, literal and metaphorical, was thickening once again. The British line had struck with deadly precision, but the outcome of the day still hung in the balance. In this crucial hour, the next actions would determine whether Jervis's daring gambit succeeded, or whether the Spanish fleet would shake free and overwhelm the smaller British force. Nelson was about to force the issue in a way that would define the battle, his career, and the future of British naval warfare. As the battle intensified along the fractured Spanish front, the clash of iron and oak echoed across the Atlantic swells. Thick banks of powder smoke drifted across the water, veiling entire ships from sight and revealing them again as ghost-like silhouettes illuminated by flashes of cannon fire. The disciplined British line had driven a wedge between the Spanish divisions, tearing into the leeward ships with measured, thunderous broadsides. Yet the danger was far from resolved. To the northwest, the Spanish weather division still possessed the maneuvering room needed to bear down and unite with its embattled comrades. If allowed to regroup, the enormous numerical advantage of the Spanish fleet, 25 to 27 ships of the line, and over 20,000 men, could still turn the tide. It was at this critical juncture that Commodore Horatio Nelson, aboard the 74-gun HMS Captain, confronted a choice that few naval officers would dare to contemplate. Positioned toward the rear of the British line, he had a vantage point uniquely suited to assess the shifting situation. Through the veils of smoke, he observed the Spanish weather division slipping slowly toward escape. Huge ships of the line, including heavy first rates, catching the wind and beginning to edge away from the converging British fire. If those ships escaped, they could later descend upon the British van in overwhelming force. If they rejoined the leeward division, the British line might suddenly find itself attacked on both sides. The bold insertion of Jervis's fleet into the Spanish Gap would become a trap for the aggressors instead of the defenders. Nelson recognized this with a clarity that struck him as sharply as any broadside. Remaining within the line would maintain textbook naval doctrine, but it would also allow the Spanish divisions the opportunity to reunite. That risk was unacceptable. Thus he made a decision that would forever distinguish him from his contemporaries. Nelson ordered the captain to turn out of the British line, an action strictly against conventional admiralty instructions. By leaving the line, he would expose his ship to isolated attack from multiple larger Spanish vessels. He would be acting without orders, but the tactical advantage to be gained was unmistakable. Nelson intended to position Captain between the weather division and their path of escape, blocking the attempt to join forces and compelling the Spanish to fight under conditions favorable to the British. As the helm shifted, Captain's bow swung toward the looming hulls of the Spanish three-deckers. Her sails flapped momentarily before filling with wind. The crew immediately sensed that something extraordinary was happening. Gun crews steadied their weapons in anticipation of the sudden and violent engagement that would follow. Marines on the upper deck fixed bayonets, their silhouettes cutting through the drifting fog like still figures painted against a storm. Captains surged forward, bearing down upon ships far larger and more heavily armed. Among them loomed the titanic Santissima Trinidad, a four-decked behemoth mounting around 130 guns and manned by more than 1,000 sailors and soldiers. Nearby, the imposing San Nicolas, San Joseph, and other ships of 112 guns maneuvered to repel the unexpected British intrusion. Seen from Captain's deck, their towering sides appeared like fortified cliffs, bristling with gun ports. Even with supporting fire from ships such as Culloden, Orion, and Blenheim, the danger was immense. Captain, a 74-gun third-rate carrying roughly 650 men, was about to engage in the naval equivalent of charging 3 fortresses at once. The first Spanish salvos crashed into Captain's hull, splintering oak and tearing through rigging. Shards of wood exploded across the gun decks in deadly sprays. Still, Nelson pressed forward. His ship's guns, loaded for close combat, roared back in thunderous retaliation. Double-shotted broadsides smashed into the sides of the larger Spanish ships at a proximity so close that the gunners could hear the cries of the enemy through the smoke. As Captain maneuvered between the giants, her rigging began to fail. Shots from Santissima Trinidad and the 2 massive first rates shredded sails and severed ropes. Captain's masts groaned under the strain. The deck became a chaos of debris, fallen spars, smoking splinters, and the wounded being carried below. Yet Nelson's determination was unshakable. His objective was not merely to inflict damage, it was to block the Spanish weather division and hold it in place until the rest of the British fleet could complete its crushing work to leeward. Every minute that Captain remained engaged, every broadside that prevented the Spanish ships from escaping downwind, contributed to the larger tactical picture that Nelson had grasped with instinctive clarity. Supported by intermittent fire from Culloden and Excellent, Nelson succeeded in forcing the weather division to halt and turn. Spanish captains, facing this aggressive incursion, found their maneuvering lanes constricted. The giant ships struggled to coordinate their responses, and their intended convergence on the leeward division faltered. The very risk Nelson had identified was now being neutralized, not through cautious adherence to formation, but through daring initiative. Still, the cost to Captain was severe. Her rigging hung in tatters. Multiple spars had fallen, and her ability to maneuver was now severely compromised. She drifted dangerously close to the shattered San Nicolas, a Spanish 80-gun ship already racked by British fire. Captain's crew braced as the two ships collided, their hulls grinding together in the smoke-filled chaos. It was here, amid this collision of timber and iron, that Nelson's audacity would be pushed even further, leading him toward one of the most astonishing feats of the age. Captain, battered almost to the point of disablement, now lay alongside a wounded Spanish ship and within reach of another. The thunder of broadsides gave way to the clash of close combat preparations as boarding parties mustered. The moment would soon come when Nelson would attempt an unprecedented act, one that would forever be immortalized as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates. But for now, the battered captain clung to San Nicolas, and the Spanish Weather Division remained trapped by Nelson's aggression. The turning point of the battle had arrived, forged not by massed firepower alone, but by the resolve of a single ship and her commander to impose his will on a fleet twice the size of his own. The sea around HMS Captain had become a maelstrom of drifting smoke, shattered timber, and swirling spray. The cries of gunners, the groan of damaged masts, and the relentless thunder of cannon fire merged into a single overwhelming roar. Captain, her rigging shredded and her maneuverability all but destroyed, was now locked against the battered hull of the Spanish San Nicolas, an 80-gun ship that had already suffered under devastating British fire. The collision brought the two ships together with a grinding shudder, their yards and shrouds entangling in a chaotic mesh. Captain's deck bore the scars of her desperate advance. The fallen spars, torn canvas, and rising smoke all bore witness to the ferocity of the fight. Many of her guns were still firing, each blast sending shockwaves across the ship as crews worked frantically in the oppressive heat and smoke. Powder-stained sailors and marines stood ready along the bulwarks, sensing that the nature of the combat was about to change. The collision with San Nicolas had created a rare moment, one where the great guns could no longer decide the matter, and the next phase would be determined by close action. Across the narrow gap between the two great ships, the Spanish decks were visible through breaks in the drifting smoke. Splintered planks, fallen rigging, and the bodies of the wounded marked the path of British broadsides. Spanish soldiers, many drawn from regiments more accustomed to land warfare, attempted to regroup amid the wreckage. Their officers shouted instructions over the noise, urging them to repel the British ship now pressing alongside their own. But Captain had not come alone. The relentless fire from HMS Excellent, commanded by Captain Cuthbert Collingwood, had contributed significantly to the destruction of both San Nicolas and the massive San Joseph, a 112-gun ship looming just beyond her. Excellent's broadsides had crippled San Jose's maneuverability and killed or wounded many on board, including the Spanish Admiral Francisco Javier Windhuisen, who had suffered mortal wounds during the combat. By the time Captain collided with San Nicolas, both Spanish ships were badly damaged, their guns silenced or in disarray. Recognizing the opportunity, Nelson prepared to lead his men directly onto the deck of San Nicolas. There was no dramatic declaration, no shouted command intended for posterity, only the steady, determined motion of a commander who understood the strategic importance of the moment. The decision was made with the same clarity and audacity that had defined his earlier break from the line. If the Spanish ships could not be overwhelmed by gunfire alone, they would be taken by hand-to-hand assault. Boarding parties comprised of sailors and marines surged forward. Marines, equipped with muskets and bayonets, formed the first wave, ready to suppress any resistance from the Spanish tops or upper decks. Sailors armed with cutlasses, pistols, and boarding pikes followed close behind. Sand scattered across the decks helped them keep their footing as they climbed the gangways and scrambled through the shattered remains of the bulwarks. The scene on San Nicolas's deck was chaotic and brutal. Smoke clung to every surface, and the boards were littered with splinters and debris. The Spanish defenders, already disoriented by the broadsides from Captain and Excellent, struggled to mount a cohesive defense. British Marines established a foothold near the enemy's quarterdeck, firing into the dense haze to suppress resistance. Sailors poured over the railings behind them, securing the deck inch by inch through sheer weight and determination. As British forces gained control of San Nicolas's deck, another colossal shape drifted into them. The massive San Josef, her hull severely damaged and her maneuverability gone, had lost control and drifted alongside San Nicolas, the two Spanish ships becoming entangled against one another under the pressure of wind and swell. Through the fog and the wreckage, Nelson recognized an extraordinary opportunity, perhaps one never seen before in a naval battle of this scale. With the two Spanish ships locked together and Captain's boarding party already in control of San Nicolas, he saw a path to seize the second ship directly. The height of San Josef's bulwarks made a direct assault from Captain impossible. But now, with San Nicolas jammed between them, the battered decks formed a natural ramp. Nelson used the wreckage of San Nicolas as a bridge, a makeshift path that would later be immortalized as Nelson's patent bridge for boarding first rates. He moved swiftly, leading his men across the debris-littered deck of San Nicolas and up the side of San Josef. Marines provided covering fire from behind, shooting at any Spanish soldiers attempting to rally. Sailors climbed the tangled rigging and hauled themselves over shattered rails. It was an ascent carried out amidst smoke, noise, and the constant threat of counterattack. But momentum was on the British side. Once aboard San Josef, the British rapidly overcame what remained of the defenders. San Josef's crew, decimated by Excellent's earlier fire and disoriented by the sudden boarding, could not form a cohesive line of resistance. Within minutes, the towering first rate, mounting over 100 guns and manned by hundreds of men, was forced to yield. The Spanish colours were struck, replaced by the unmistakable ensign of the Royal Navy. With that gesture, Nelson had achieved the almost unimaginable, the capture of two major enemy ships, one after the other, with a single 74-gun vessel that had already been battered nearly to the point of disablement. On the decks below, the scale of the achievement became clear. British sailors and Marines secured prisoners, extinguished fires, and consolidated their hold on the captured ships. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the reek of smoke and the brine-heavy wind. The decks were scarred by grape-shot and round-shot, and the groaning of wounded timbers matched the low murmurs of the injured being tended to. Far from a reckless gamble, Nelson's actions had been a calculated strike at the heart of the Spanish formation. By seizing San Nicolas and San Josef, he not only deprived the Spanish fleet of two major ships, but also shattered the spirit of the weather division, trapping them in a position from which they could no longer influence the wider battle. Meanwhile, to the south, British ships such as Excellent, Culloden, and Prince George continued to punish the Spanish leeward division. The carefully coordinated British assault, amplified by Nelson's independent brilliance, had now turned the tide decisively against Spain. What had begun as a daring break from the line had evolved into one of the most famous boarding actions in naval history, a moment of audacity that embodied the courage, quick thinking, and sheer determination that defined the Royal Navy during its struggle for supremacy in the Age of Sail. The capture of San Nicolas and San Josef marked a dramatic turning point in the unfolding struggle off Cape St. Vincent. The British line, already pressing hard against the Spanish leeward division, now saw its foothold strengthened by the astonishing seizure of two major enemy ships in the centre of the action. The spectacle of a single 74-gun vessel, HMS Captain, taking not one, but two vastly larger adversaries, sent ripples of shock through the Spanish ranks. Their weather division, already hampered by confusion and damage, found itself increasingly unable to manoeuvre freely or rejoin its embattled comrades. Across the battlefield, the British ships continued to exploit their advantage with relentless efficiency. As Nelson secured his position aboard the captured Spanish vessels, the van and centre of the British line maintained their hammering assaults upon the struggling Spanish leeward ships. HMS Excellent, having played a decisive role in crippling San Nicolas and San Josef, now turned her fire upon the massive Salvador del Mundo, one of Spain's heaviest ships of the line, mounting well over 100 guns. Salvador del Mundo had been attempting to turn into position, but the earlier British broadsides had shattered her rigging, leaving her topmasts hanging at precarious angles. Excellent approached with measured purpose, delivering a devastating series of close-range broadsides. Each thunderous discharge tore deeper into the giant ship's hull, sending showers of splinters across her decks and cutting down her remaining defenders. With her maneuverability gone and her gunnery severely compromised, Salvador del Mundo could no longer resist effectively. Her tattered colours were finally pulled down, and British sailors moved to secure yet another towering prize amid the drifting clouds of smoke. Nearby, San Isidro, a smaller but still formidable 74-gun Spanish ship, found herself equally beleaguered. Struggling to maintain formation and overwhelmed by British fire, she attempted to break away from the melee. But the British ships pressing forward, among them Orion, Culloden, and Blenheim, closed the distance rapidly. Cut off and battered, San Isidro struck her colours as well, becoming the fourth major Spanish ship to fall into British hands that day. The cumulative effect of these captures was devastating for the Spanish fleet. 4 ships of the line, including 2 heavy first-rates, had been claimed by the British, and their loss reverberated through the remaining Spanish ranks. The ships yet unengaged struggled to coordinate amidst the smoke and confusion. Signals were lost or misinterpreted in the chaos, and the Spanish commanders, including Don José de Córdoba y Ramos, found themselves unable to reassert control over their fragmented divisions. The mighty Santísima Trinidad, despite her imposing size and formidable armament, was in no better condition. She had sustained severe damage earlier in the fight, her hull and rigging suffering under the relentless fire from British 74s. Her foredecks and towering bulk, once symbols of Spanish naval prestige, now became liabilities. The enormous ship was slow to respond to orders, difficult to maneuver, and increasingly exposed to British attention. As the battle progressed, she drifted out of position, her crew struggling under the immense demands of managing such a colossal vessel in the midst of battle. Yet despite the damage inflicted on Santísima Trinidad, she managed to avoid capture. Her immense size and the desperate efforts of her crew allowed her to limp away from the heaviest fighting, accompanied by several Spanish ships that still retained some degree of maneuverability. These vessels, clustered around the flagship, attempted to rally to Córdoba's side as the Spanish admiral fought to preserve what remained of his fleet. Back in the thick of the engagement, the British ships continued to operate with coordinated precision. The intense drilling and discipline instilled by Jervis now bore fruit in the most vivid fashion. Even amidst swirling smoke and cannon flashes, the British captains maintained strict formations, preventing the chaos that often befell large-scale naval battles. Clear signalling, experienced leadership, and seamless cooperation allowed them to respond instantly to changing circumstances. One after another, British ships adapted to support the larger tactical picture. HMS Victory, still central to the battle, directed coordinated broadsides against Spanish ships attempting to escape. Victory's towering hull and powerful armament made her a floating anchor for the British line, a steadfast presence around which the rest of the fleet manoeuvred with calculated precision. Britannia, Barfleur, and Prince George contributed their heavy guns to the rolling barrages that kept the remaining Spanish ships at bay. While the British inflicted severe damage, they also maintained extraordinary discipline in damage control. Crews worked tirelessly to extinguish fires and repair rigging, even as the ships continued to fire. The decks were managed with a practiced calm that allowed the British ships to retain their battle readiness throughout the long, grinding engagement. Meanwhile, the Spanish position deteriorated further with every passing minute. Ships in the centre and leeward divisions suffered catastrophic losses in rigging, making them increasingly vulnerable to raking fire. Others drifted out of formation entirely, unable to reconnect with their fellows. The fog, which earlier had offered a degree of concealment, now turned against the Spanish as drifting smoke mingled with natural haze, obscuring their signals and fracturing their coordination. Everywhere the Spanish looked, the signs of collapse were clear. The capture of flagship-level vessels such as San Josef and Salvador del Mundo symbolized not just tactical defeat, but a psychological blow from which the fleet could not recover. Cordoba's attempts to restore order went unanswered. His divisions were scattered, his flagship battered, and his ability to control the field effectively lost. As the battle neared its climax, the British line, though strained in places, remained cohesive and unbroken. Nelson's daring maneuver had stopped the Spanish Weather Division from descending upon the British van, while the combined firepower of Jervis's main line shattered the cohesion of the Spanish Leeward Division. The hours of close combat, gunnery exchanges, and boarding actions had reshaped the battle from a contest of numbers into a demonstration of controlled aggression and tactical excellence. The Spanish fleet, once so intimidating in sheer size, was now in full retreat. Those ships still able to maneuver gathered around the damaged Santísima Trinidad and turned away from the British line, seeking the safety of distance and the hope of returning to Cadiz. The battle was all but decided. Amidst fires smouldering across captured decks, amid wounded sailors being tended below, and amid the acrid fog of lingering smoke, the British fleet stood triumphant. But while the day had been won through a combination of discipline, courage, and audacity, the battle's full reckoning and its strategic consequences were still to come. As the smoke of battle slowly thinned across the Atlantic swells, the full magnitude of what had occurred off Cape St. Vincent became clear. The Spanish fleet, though vast in number and formidable in appearance, was now in disordered retreat. Its surviving ships, including the battered Santísima Trinidad, limped away under tattered sails, accompanied by those vessels that still retained enough rigging and seaworthiness to escape the relentless British pressure. The day had seen the capture of 4 Spanish ships of the line: San Nicolas, San Josef, Salvador del Mundo, and San Isidro, each representing not just a tactical victory, but a symbolic blow to Spanish naval prestige. For the British fleet, battered but intact, the immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled activity. Captured ships required securing, fires extinguished, and wounded tended to. British sailors moved swiftly through the decks of the prizes, stamping out embers and cutting away damaged rigging. Surgeons aboard each ship of the line worked tirelessly through the evening, tending to both British and Spanish casualties. The lower decks were filled with the groans of the wounded and the steady motion of medical teams moving through cramped, lantern-lit spaces. Casualty figures reflected the intensity of the engagement. British losses, though modest relative to the scale of victory, still amounted to around 73 killed and 227 wounded, with HMS captains suffering some of the heaviest damage and casualties. Spanish losses were far more severe, totaling more than 430 killed, 850 wounded, and roughly 3,000 men taken prisoner, many of them now under guard within their own captured ships. The contrast between these figures illustrated the gulf in training, discipline, and tactical cohesion between the two fleets. On the decks of those 4 captured Spanish ships, British colours were raised. Their once proud hulls, now marked by the dark scars of close-range broadsides, had become monuments to the skill and tenacity of their captors. The success of the British boarding parties and the discipline of their gunnery crews had turned a day that should have favoured Spanish numbers into one that overwhelmingly favoured British resolve. Across the British fleet, amidst the bustle of post-battle labour, moments of profound pride and relief began to ripple through the ranks. The sailors knew what they had accomplished. Against nearly double their number, they had fought with precision, courage, and unwavering discipline. The victory was not merely tactical, it was monumental. It demonstrated once again the Royal Navy's ability to overcome numerical inferiority through the combined force of training, seamanship, and audacity. Among the officers who contributed to the victory, none would be more celebrated than Commodore Horatio Nelson. His extraordinary decision to break from the line and confront the Spanish Weather Division directly had prevented a disastrous regrouping. His subsequent boarding of San Nicolas and San Josef, culminating in the improvised bridge between the 2 Spanish ships, stood as one of the most daring actions in naval warfare. It was an achievement that electrified the fleet. Nelson, covered in powder smoke and exhausted from the exertion of battle, was summoned to HMS Victory after the engagement, where Admiral Jervis recognized the full significance of his actions. For Jervis himself, The victory represented the culmination of his strategic vision. Throughout the build-up to the battle, he had recognized that Britain's position in the Mediterranean and Atlantic required decisive action. With Spain now allied to revolutionary France, British naval dominance was under threat. Jervis's bold decision to intercept the Spanish fleet, combined with his strict insistence on precision and discipline within his own line, had prevented the union of the Spanish and French fleets. The consequences would be far-reaching. In London, news of the victory spread quickly, inspiring national pride at a moment when Britain faced constant pressure from French campaigns in Europe and the Mediterranean. Jervis was elevated to the peerage as Earl St. Vincent, an honour reflecting not only his command on the day, but his wider strategic importance. Nelson, too, was celebrated across the nation. His knighthood and rapid rise in prominence would set the stage for his later triumphs, culminating at Trafalgar. Strategically, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent reshaped the naval balance of the French Revolutionary Wars. For Spain, the defeat was catastrophic. Admiral Cordoba, whose fleet had been scattered and unable to form an effective line of battle, was disgraced and dismissed from service. The Spanish Navy, long considered one of Europe's great maritime powers, suffered a blow to morale and a significant reduction in fighting strength. Many of the captured ships, once symbols of Spanish might, would never return to active service under their original flag. Some would serve the Royal Navy, others would be dismantled after inspection revealed the extensive damage sustained during the battle. More importantly, the Spanish fleet's retreat to Cadiz effectively ended any possibility of coordinating with the French fleet at Brest. The loss of 4 capital ships and the crippling of several others meant that Spain could not project meaningful naval power in the near term. This outcome ensured British dominance in the Atlantic approaches and provided vital breathing room for British operations elsewhere. Yet the most profound consequence of the battle lay not in its immediate strategic fallout, but in what it revealed about the evolving nature of naval warfare. The battle demonstrated that bold initiative, executed within the framework of disciplined formation, could overcome greater numbers. It showed that a smaller, unified fleet could exploit the disorganization of a larger opponent through superior seamanship and the willingness to take calculated risks. Above all, it highlighted the centrality of leadership. Jervis's steady command and Nelson's daring assault combined to produce a result that neither approach, alone, could have achieved. The victory at Cape St. Vincent became a cornerstone of Britain's naval legacy, a testament to the power of preparation, the value of courage under fire, and the enduring importance of decisive action in the face of overwhelming odds. It inspired a new generation of naval officers, reinforced Britain's claim to maritime supremacy, and signalled to the world that the Royal Navy, though often outnumbered, would not be outfought. As dusk settled across the battle zone, the British fleet, still in formation, towing its captured prizes, turned away from the shattered remnants of the Spanish Armada. The smoke drifted off toward the Portuguese coast, and the sea, which had roared with fury throughout the day, now quieted into the muted rhythm of evening swells. On the horizon, the dim silhouettes of fleeing Spanish ships disappeared into the gathering night. Behind them, under British control, sailed 4 massive symbols of victory. Ahead of them lay a future shaped by courage, discipline, and the unwavering resolve of those who fought at Cape St. Vincent. In the days following the engagement off Cape St. Vincent, the British fleet made its way toward Lisbon, towing its captured prizes across the Atlantic swells. The battered hulks of San Nicolas, San Josef, Salvador del Mundo, and San Isidro drifted behind their captors, like enormous, humbled beasts subdued after a fierce struggle. Their splintered sides and blackened timbers bore silent witness to the violence of the battle, a testimony to the precision and ferocity of British gunnery and seamanship. For the sailors aboard the Royal Navy ships, the sight of these massive prizes trailing behind them was more than a symbol of victory. It was a vindication of their training, their courage, and their unwavering discipline under fire. As the fleet approached port, the wider significance of the victory began to take shape in the minds of commanders and sailors alike. Though the battle had lasted only a few critical hours, its consequences would echo far beyond the waters of Portugal. It had reversed a string of strategic challenges that had plagued British fortunes during the opening years of the French Revolutionary Wars. With Spain's entry into the conflict, Britain had faced a severe threat: the possibility of a united Franco-Spanish naval force capable of overwhelming the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. But the battle, under the resolute leadership of Admiral Sir John Jervis, had shattered that threat before it could materialize. For Jervis, the victory represented the culmination of sound planning, uncompromising discipline, and a willingness to engage a numerically superior enemy with controlled aggression. His insistence on tight formations, clearly defined night orders, and rigorous training had transformed his fleet into a cohesive force capable of independent initiative when conditions demanded it. The decision to drive between the Spanish divisions, exploiting their disarray and forcing an engagement on British terms, displayed strategic insight of the highest order. His reward, the title Earl St. Vincent, was both a personal honour and a recognition of the vital strategic service he had rendered to Britain. Yet it was Commodore Horatio Nelson whose actions would come to embody the daring spirit of the Royal Navy in this era. His choice to break from the line, a breach of conventional doctrine, had not only prevented the Spanish Weather Division from forming a united front, but had also set the stage for one of the most audacious boarding actions in naval history. The capture of San Nicolas and San Joseph, achieved using the wrecked upper deck of the former as a bridge, demonstrated not only his courage, but his ability to improvise under pressure with extraordinary clarity of purpose. Nelson's rise in fame following the battle was meteoric. Already recognized as a promising officer, his conduct at Cape St. Vincent marked him as a commander of exceptional daring and tactical brilliance. The events of that February day would serve as a precursor to later triumphs, most notably at Aboukir Bay and Trafalgar, where his innovative approach to naval warfare would again prove decisive. Cape St. Vincent became the first major step in the creation of the Nelson legend, the defining narrative of Britain's naval supremacy during the Age of Sail. The broader consequences for Spain were grave. The battered remnants of Cordoba's fleet retreated to Cadiz, where they remained blockaded for much of the subsequent conflict. The loss of 4 major ships, combined with the severe damage sustained by others, crippled Spain's ability to operate as an effective naval partner to France. Cordoba himself, unable to account for the disarray and collapse of his massive fleet, was dismissed in disgrace. The Spanish Navy, once a proud maritime power, began a long period of decline from which it would struggle to recover. Strategically, the victory ensured that the French could not count on Spanish naval support in the Atlantic. The combined fleet that might have threatened Britain's global empire would never materialize. This allowed the Royal Navy to retain its command of the sea lanes, safeguarding British trade, colonial interests, and the movement of troops across the empire. The security afforded by this command would, in turn, fuel Britain's economic and military resilience throughout the protracted wars against France. But beyond the immediate strategic and political consequences, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent carried a deeper legacy. It represented a turning point in the evolution of naval warfare. The engagement demonstrated the power of disciplined line-of-battle tactics when supported by independent, decisive action from subordinate commanders. It highlighted the importance of gunnery practice, ship handling, and damage control, all areas in which the Royal Navy excelled. And it revealed that even the largest and most imposing ships could be outmaneuvered, outgunned, and boarded when confronted by a smaller but more cohesive and confident force. For the men who fought that day, the battle would remain etched in memory. Many sailors would carry the scars of splinter wounds, burned powder, or crushed limbs for the rest of their lives. Others, who perished in the smoke or fell beneath the weight of shattered rigging, would be remembered by their shipmates through the stories passed from mess table to forecastle. Spanish prisoners, now confined aboard their former ships under British control, faced an uncertain future, but were, for the moment, attended with the same grim professionalism that the Royal Navy applied to all matters of war. The sea itself seemed to transition as the days passed. The waters that had raged with cannon blasts and the screams of men softened once more into the steady rhythm of winter swells. The drifting haze that had shrouded the opening stages of the battle lifted, revealing a calm, pale horizon. Cape St. Vincent, its cliffs standing sentinel over the site of the confrontation, remained unchanged, a silent witness to the victory forged in its shadow. Generations later, the battle would be studied for its lessons in leadership, discipline, and boldness. It would stand alongside the greatest naval victories in British history, a precursor to Trafalgar and a testament to the resolve that defined the Royal Navy during the most turbulent decades of the 18th and 19th centuries. In the end, the Battle of Cape St. Vincent was more than a triumph of guns and sail. It was a victory of character, of an admiral who refused to be daunted by superior numbers, of officers who trusted their commanders and seized opportunity when it appeared, and of sailors whose skill and courage transformed tactical brilliance into lasting achievement. It was a moment when the fate of nations turned on the judgment of a few and the determination of many. And as the British fleet returned to port, towing the enormous trophies of its triumph, one truth had become undeniable. The Royal Navy, though outnumbered, would never be outfought. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.